Welcome to the city. I'm Anthony Wilson, the Public Information Officer for the City of San Angelo. And joining us today are a couple of members of our Fort Concho staff, Bob Bluehart, who is the site manager, and Corey Robinson. And we're here to talk about the acquisition of some historic items here at Fort Concho. Bob, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, we're always on the lookout for what we would call pieces of the true cross, original items. And a month or two ago, Corey, who is allowed to troll on eBay, all staff do, because you can find some really good historical stuff on there. Corey came to me and said, there's a letter on eBay to Mrs. Grierson, who is the wife of the post commander, and it's available for maybe under $100. So I said, follow that puppy, go get him, let's get that letter. Well, it was a trail, because the collector, the owner of the original letter, who sold it to us through eBay, saw that it was bought by a Fort Concho operation, and that opened up a treasure trove of other letters, and that's why we're here today.
So let's talk a little bit about the acquisition of those letters. So Corey, tell us the story about how you ended up finding this first letter on the internet.
When I look on eBay, I'll try to look for things that are original to the time period and get some ideas for things that we're creating, or maybe find something that's a reproduction item that we can actually use for living history. And then every once in a while I'll type in Fort Concho just to see what comes up, or maybe even Texas forts just to see what comes up. And every once in a while there will be a document that's in relation to maybe an officer from the time period, but rarely do you see something that is directly related to Fort Concho in the way of personal correspondence. So that is a wonderful piece of memorabilia, a piece of item, an item that we can actually utilize here, because a pay document is wonderful. It may have an officer's name on it, but it just tells us how much he got paid. But when you get a personal letter, a letter that has detail and very small, minute details about daily life at Fort Concho, that's just a wonderful piece and a treasure of information that we can utilize here. So once I found it, like Bob said, I contacted him to make sure it was okay to start bidding. So I got into a bidding war. Unfortunately, it wasn't a buy it now price. So I got into a bidding war, and the high price that I put on it was more than enough to actually be able to purchase it at the end of the auction, because somebody was waiting at the very last second to try to outbid me, but they didn't make it.
So when you found this thing, did your heart sort of skip a beat going, oh my goodness, we might have something really important here?
Yes, like I said, those normal documents, the everyday like pay documents, you see hundreds of those on eBay right now, but you rarely see these personal correspondence letters. And it was kind of a rush, because I know that these things are very popular. Everybody wants that personal letter that somebody sent of the time period, and it was like you said, a rush to try to get this.
And it's interesting that people are selling these sort of items on eBay. Is that now sort of the go-to site for these sort of historical artifacts?
It is, because you can find anything you ever wanted, including this type of stuff, any kind of collectible that you've ever wanted, from here all across to Australia to England. So eBay is a wonderful source, not only to buy stuff, but like I said, to do a little bit of research when you're trying to figure out an original item, what it looked like, its dimensions, its size. You can find some of those things on there.
So once you find an item like this, I mean, obviously you have to verify it in order to know if it's authentic or not. How do you do that? What's the process there?
We first looked at the letter itself to kind of compare and see what was being talked about, of course, to make sure it actually was a letter, to see if it was from Fort Concho, so just the basic checking on it. But I personally, not as a friend, but I do know the dealer, and I know he's a fairly reputable dealer, that he's been in the business for so many years. So Bob and I did a little research to make sure that he was a reputable individual, to make sure that his company was reputable. He does have a website out there that he has sold these type of documents for at least 25 years. And we wanted to make sure that the change of hands, so to speak, was legal, that this wasn't something that somebody had found by going into somebody else's house and picking it up out of their attic. So we wanted to make sure that this was all legal in the transfer, and purchasing this one and then talking to the gentleman and making sure that the larger collection was actually from a reputable source as well.
Bob, of course, you have to manage the Fort Concho budget. How do you go about putting a price tag on something like this and trying to figure out what its worth is?
Well, there's an expression that's priceless, but that doesn't work in real life. There's a price to everything. When we were offered the batch of letters, and I believe the price was $4,800.
Mm-hmm.
We calculated that individually those letters would be worth much, much more on the market. So the price itself was good. Second, this was $4,800 traded for 3 dozen letters, the likes of which will not be seen again. Not in one place, not at one time, not in one situation. It was a very reasonable price. We're fortunate that the fort has a support arm called the Fort Concho Foundation, which is private money independent of our city operating funds. This foundation was set up over 30 years ago for many reasons, but precisely for today, it's for situations where we need to move quickly and fast to get something that we couldn't possibly do through the city system, because by nature it is methodical and just is not set up to work quickly. So I went to our foundation board and I said, we must have these letters, or the phrase we used at the meeting was, the letters must come home. The foundation board was delighted with the opportunity, immediately pledged 50% of the cost, and then one of my foundation board members, Dr. Rex Bashan, said, I will guarantee you the rest of the money before supper. You don't get those kind of offers very often from a board, and he was good to his word. He gave the other $1,200. He got another philanthropist in the area, Elaine Bridges, and by supper time, we had the $4,800. We notified the collector the next day, check cut, check mailed, and the letters came to us a week later, and it was very exciting indeed when they arrived.
So you said that this was actually a very good price for these number of letters. Did you get a little bit of a hometown discount because they were coming home to Fort Concho?
I don't know if we got a full hometown discount, but I think we got the opportunity that perhaps we didn't deserve if you look at this commercially. He could have sold those 3 dozen letters individually, piece by piece, over a multi-year period, and probably brought a lot more money. He could have figured that if we were interested in them, a number of the Grierson family sites, like a Fort Davis or a Fort Sill or Fort Huachuca, Arizona, where Grierson was posted, granted not when these letters were written, he might have tried to sell them there. I was a little fearful that our enthusiasm might lead him to believe, oh goodness, these are probably worth more than I'm offering them for. But he seemed reputable, Corey did his homework, and we had a deal, and a deal's a deal. And we're just delighted they're home. I mean, these letters will be here forever.
Well, I should mention, we're doing this interview in Officer Quarters 1, and perhaps they were written in the very room that we're sitting in right now.
Definitely they were written in this building. Now, the room we're sitting in actually was Colonel Grierson's administrative offices, which he built when he moved here in the late 1870s, because he didn't want to put up with all the annoyance of walking to his main office down at the headquarters building. But it's definite that these letters were written in this building. In fact, if you look around it, you can imagine Alice some evening, as it's dark, by lamplight, sitting down with ink and pen and scratching these letters out. It brings to the end of the story really the way history should be. You have the story, you know the person, and now you have the documents and the artifacts. It's a full circle. And as Evelyn and Corey have and will point out, it brings an immense level of detail to stories that we've just figured we knew, but now we know for sure.
Well, and Corey, you're a historian. What is the importance of these letters in your mind?
This gives you, like Bob said, those minute details, the small details of just the everyday life. So in normal documents from the military of the period, they're not going to tell you who came to the birthday party or what presents were given or who was necessarily sick at the time period and what child couldn't come to that birthday party. So it's those small things that come out that give you more of appreciation of just their life at the time period, what they had to endure, what they had to go through, the happy, the sad, everything that they would live at the time.
So when you received these letters and you saw them for the first time, what was sort of your first reaction upon seeing them and then reading through them?
Wow.
The first thing, of course, is we're going to have to open these up. So very delicately, we're going to have to open them up. So the care was kind of my first thought. We need to get these open. We need to open them up, get some acid-free sleeves to put into them, and then we can start diving into the actual letters themselves. And if you're not familiar with some of these documents, if you haven't read a lot of 19th century letters or 18th century letters, sometimes you really have to get used to the handwriting. So it is a process. You start reading that individual's handwriting, and after a few minutes you'll get more accustomed to the way they make their letters, and then you can start reading the entire letter. So you do have to kind of train yourself to be able to read some of these letters. Luckily for that time period, penmanship was of utmost importance for a lot of families, and a lot of these individuals, were very good in how they wrote. Their penmanship was very well.
Bob, in your mind, why are these important now to have back at Fort Concho?
Because this is where they were written. This is the place that they wrote about. The people who lived here are what the letters cover. Ultimately, in our wildest dreams, we would like every single stick of furniture, every gun, every piece of clothing, every document, everything that the fort ever had in its 22-year history. Unlike some forts in smaller communities where the town never grew up that large, a lot of the stuff stayed in the community. St. Angelo, in a way, caused Fort Concho stuff to fly to the four winds. The letters were never returned, the furniture was sold, the supplies were given away. This is a major, major deal for us. This brings back to the fort literal pieces of the true life. There are a number of other letters that Alice wrote, and we have transcripts of them. They're published in other books. These are the real thing. You can look at that letter and imagine Alice sitting down one night writing it. There's no filtering. There's no translation. There's nothing in between you and the original document, and that's about as good as history gets. Now, it's not the Declaration of Independence, but for us, it's darn close in terms of what we try to do here.
We're talking with our friends from Fort Concho, and we'll continue this conversation in just a moment. But first, we're going to spotlight another outstanding city employee, Carl Van de Sterre of our Water Reclamation Facility.
I love the fact that I get to wake up every morning knowing I get to go to work for my community. I know it sounds odd, but I actually enjoy knowing that, every day I go to work, if I do my job right, we treat the water and it poses no threat to my fellow citizens, to my community, to the environment. I get to go to work every day knowing that I get to work for every friend I have and every other member of our community. Anything that goes down the drain, be it washed away, flushed away, it comes here. We treat the wastewater to break down pathogens and bioorganic matter to make the water safer for the environment and safer for humans. Well, basically what we do is we do what Mother Nature does, only we do it in a much more refined process, much more efficiently, much faster, and in a much smaller area. What we treat here in one day would take Mother Nature approximately 3 months and 20 times the size to do the same thing. We are regulated by TCEQ, who in turn works with the EPA on a national level, and they regulate what we can put out and how we treat it, and they also regulate, what the water treatment facility does, what they put out. There are a myriad of guidelines that we have to follow to make sure everything is 100% healthy and environmentally sound. Well, I've always been very dedicated to math and science, and the process out here is very math and science oriented. You have biology, you have chemistry, you have physics, and you have geometry. We deal with it every day, and the entire process, I just love. The most challenging part of my job is trying to pre-guess what's going to happen. We have to alter what we do out here to make sure the process stays as high quality as possible. And at times that can be very difficult because the flows change, the composition of the wastewater changes, the weather changes. There's so many variables you have to take into account. It's impossible to think of everything. We produce here on average between 7.5 and 8.5 million gallons per day. The water treatment facility usually is around 12 to 13 million gallons a day of production. that they're pulling out of our lakes and reservoirs. If we convert our wastewater directly into potable water, then that would take the amount pulled out of our lakes down to 3 to 4 million gallons per day. I think it's a wonderful idea. It's a completely safe process. I wouldn't mind drinking it. I'm a gamer. I love strategy games, tactical games, spend a lot of time with my friends, hanging out, playing games. Other than that, I love camping and archery. A good day away from work is spending time with my friends, my girlfriend, maybe going home to Hobbs to visit my mom and dad. My name is Carl Vanderster. I'm the supervisor of the wastewater treatment plant for the city of San Angelo. I've been with the city for 8 years.
Welcome back to the city. We are continuing our conversation with our friends from Fort Concho, our site manager Bob Bluehart and one of our historians Evelyn Lemons, about the return to Fort Concho of some very historic letters. Evelyn, we're talking about these letters from Mrs. Grierson. One of the things that strikes me about it is just the remarkable condition that these are in.
Well, paper was actually a better quality in the late 1800s than it is now. That's one of the things that probably has saved them. It also appears that Charlie probably read the letters once, maybe twice, folded them back on the same creases that Mrs. Grierson had folded them on when she mailed them to him, put them in an envelope and stashed them somewhere. The 2 letters in this collection that are from Robert are in poorer condition. The envelopes, one of them doesn't match the letter as far as the date. So he was a little more careless, but you can kind of pick that out of his personality too in the way the letters are written. The outside, the covers, envelopes show much more wear than the letters themselves. There's one where he was practicing his penmanship on it. So I think that was a big part of it. They haven't seen the light of day in a long time. Daylight's one of the major enemies of ink. So that's part of why they're preserved so well.
What are the odds that you would see letters that are this old in this sort of a condition from a historical standpoint?
Probably not as rare as you would think. Like I said, the paper was a better quality. I'm not an expert on the ink, but it seems the ink lasted longer. When they wrote in pencil, that's a little harder. But if you can find the letters, if they've been kept, if they've been treasured, then they're in good condition. It's the ones that were stuffed in a box and stuffed in the attic and the rats get into them that really show are back east and they're in a flood and float down the river and get pulled out. Those are the ones that are in bad condition. But a lot of the documents we have in our collection that are original are in very good shape.
We've established that these were written by Mrs. Grierson, and you mentioned Charlie. Talk a little bit about whom these letters were sent to and the sort of things that they also covered.
Okay. Charlie was the Griersons' oldest son. The Griersons had been married for 19 years before they came to Fort Concho. And Charlie was their firstborn. So he was at West Point at the time that they were here. Their second oldest son, Robert, was in Jacksonville, Illinois at their home place going to school. So both of their oldest children were away. That meant Alice had to write letters to keep them caught up with what was going on with the family and the family friends. And they wrote her to keep her updated on what was happening with them. And in Robert's case, Robert had to keep her updated on what was happening with him and all of the family. I'm not sure how well Robert did at that, but he tried. So those were the 2 oldest children. The children that are mentioned in the letter the most are the 3 youngest, Edith, Harry, and George. Particularly Harry and George. Edith dies while they're here at Fort Concho, right after her 13th birthday. So she's in the first part of these letters. One of the letters that we have actually is the letter that Alice writes to Charlie to tell him that his sister has passed away. But there's a lot of information about Harry and George and what they did. And as Corey mentioned earlier, the military didn't keep track of what the families were doing. So all of these details about what the kids did is great as a historian. We have written proof now that they went hunting and that they went out with their dad when he went on patrols, that they went to birthday parties, that they went to school. She mentions in here the first time school is held at Fort Concho, because it's during this time period that our chapel is turned into, or is built and becomes the chapel schoolhouse.
Makes them real people.
Well, one of the things, Evelyn, that you mentioned the other day was that the letter in which Mrs. Grierson writes about the death of her daughter, she doesn't do that until the second half of the letter, which sort of led us to surmise that perhaps that was so painful to her that she almost had to sort of ease into that.
That's kind of the feeling you get, and she really spends almost half of the letter. This is the letter. We'd actually framed it for display. She talks, and the way she writes these letters, and this was common. Okay, this is one letter, this is one letter. She starts here, so you do this part, then you turn the paper over and get to here, and then back to this side.
In the borders.
And then, yeah, and then you turn and go along the borders, and sometimes it's over here. Hers are actually a blessing. People who were really long-winded, and she does have a couple of, I guess, 8-page letters and uses 2 separate sheets of paper. We have some where the person will write either perpendicular and go across the lines or at an angle. And that can get kind of tricky figuring out where the pen goes to figure out what the words are, but it can be done. Anyway, she doesn't talk about Edith's death until almost halfway through the letter. She starts right here. And so you're already a page, almost 2 pages into the letter before she starts talking about it. And she puts in a lot of detail to her son. I mean, actually tells him about what the gravesite looked like, the flowers, the mules that drew the wagon, which wagon they used.
Evelyn, I wanted you to read a passage from one of the letters just to give our viewers an idea of the sort of color that are found in these letters.
All right, and this is sort of typical of the things that went on. Mrs. Colliday, 2 children, nurse, arrived from St. Louis yesterday. She would not have come so soon but for Major Schofield's wedding, which she expected to be in time to attend. She missed connections somehow and was more than 2 days after the wedding. Her husband is, quote, in the field, unquote, and will probably not be in until the last of the month. Mrs. Colliday wants quarters that are occupied, and the quarter question is a troublesome business today. We had a pleasant reading here on Wednesday evening. We read for an hour and then had cards, dancing, etc. We expect to keep them all winter and are to meet at Mrs. Baldwin's next week. There were 22 present here. 22 people in this house. Papa and quite a number of the officers went hunting this afternoon and expect to be gone 2 nights. It is very warm again. I am sitting in the open window now. Our new stable is almost done, and it will be much more convenient to keep the horses here than at the band stable. Papa thinks there is not the least danger of you being thrown off your horse, has great faith in your ability to ride well. Olive is going to take any letters to the office. If you have not sent a picture to Robert, please do so. You did not say whether you want me to send your Christmas present to pay your debt. Affectionately, your mother, Alice K. Grierson. So you can hear the mother in this. You know, what do you want for Christmas? Just the little details about their house. She's sitting in the window. And this letter is dated November 12th, 1878. So it was at least pleasant at that time of year. Probably had the windows open. Well, she did, open window.
Let me ask you this, Evelyn. Of course, you will make these available to the public in some way for research purposes. Talk about the different sort of people who may want to access them and how they're going to be able to access them.
Okay. As priceless as these are, There's no point in having them if we don't share them. They have to be shared. They might as well be in a drawer if you're not going to. They could have just stayed in Charlie's footlocker for all that matters. So they do have to be shared, and there will be lots of people that don't want to read them. I've already had lots of people want to read them. I've already had lots of people read them. This could be used by a PhD writing or a PhD candidate writing his thesis. It could be used by a high school student. Yes, a novelist. We've already had one of those ask. It could be used by us in recreating an exhibit or an information panel.
So what you're planning on doing is you're going to transcribe these and scan them and make them available so that you don't necessarily have to come to Fort Concho and sit down with the letters themselves.
Right. And we really don't want everybody to hold the letters. I mean, we've got them in acid, a safe environment now. These are acid free. They're safe for the papers. But even in this album where they're nice and safe, you really don't want people flipping back and forth through them. So yeah, we will have copies available for people to use. We will put them on exhibit at some point so that people can come out and see the original letters, because there is something about the original letter. It just brings you that much closer to Alice and Charlie and Edith and Harry and George. It just, it's the original.
We've been talking with our friends from Fort Concho, and we hope you'll join us for the next episode of The City.